Thanks, thanks very much, Mark, for that introduction. Thank you also to Lord Somers Can and the Powerhouse for the invitation to speak. Bernard Solomon, partner with KPMG, based in Melbourne. My presentation deals with the next 30 years, looking at Australian society, looking at Melbourne society. How will we live? What will be the issues over the next 30 years or so? I want to start with the big picture, a global perspective, and I think particularly relevant at the moment, and ask, in fact, where are the rich people on Earth today, in our time? In fact, the green bits are the richest nations on Earth. There are 7 billion people on the planet. 1 billion, including us, are in the green bits. The green bits have an income per capita of $30,000 US. In Australia, it's about 60, but we're part of the 30,000 or more. 1 billion people. The red bits are 5 billion. So for every rich person here, there's 5 somewhere else. You say, well, you know, there's North America, there's Europe, there's Australia, there's Japan, there's other little bits and pieces here and there. The observation I have is that I can see fault lines, almost like plate tectonics. And you can see there's a fault line. I mean, if you're in Mexico, why wouldn't you want to get across the border? There's 5 of us, 1 of you, you're really rich, I'm really poor. This ain't never going to go away. In 30 years, 300 years, that border is going to be an issue. And it's not so much around here because we're an island continent, but in fact, the northern border is probably going to be an issue for the Australian people for 100 years. It ain't never going to go away. It probably means we will be shoring up our defence over that time frame. And in fact, if you look at America, you look at Australia, we're surrounded by the sea. There is only one rich bit that is connected to a poor bit by a land bridge. And that's it. And in fact, that's where the flashpoint is at the moment. This will never go away. We will be dealing with this in 30 years' time, in probably 100 years' time. In fact, 7 billion people on the planet, 1 billion rich people like us. By 2050, there will still be 1 billion rich people. So our number ain't going to rise. But the poor people go from 5 to 7. So instead of every rich person having 5 poor people, there's actually going to be 7. This is not going to go away. Let's bring it back to Australia and look at the Australian community, the Australian tribes, in fact, and identify the composition of the Australian population. 24 million people on the continent. Here are the top 5 tribes. That is by non-Australian born populations. The largest, the Brits. 1 person in 25 in Australia was born in Britain. 10-pound poms that arrived here in the 1950s. Then New Zealanders, there we are, yeah, vocal. And then 600,000 New Zealanders. There's only 700,000 on the South Island of New Zealand, and this number's growing more rapidly. Then the Chinese, the Indians. Never look at the numbers in demographics. The numbers are boring. What does it tell you? When I look at this, you look at the balance of the top 10, I don't see these numbers. What I see is an Anglo, Mediterranean, Asian, Indian and rising Arabic fusion culture. That is Melbourne, that has evolved in a generation. When the Greeks, the Italians arrived here in Melbourne in the 1950s, we regarded their food as wog food. By the 1980s, realised actually your food is better than our food. By the 1990s, we started to eat out on the pavement as they did the piazza, the plaza. It took us 30 years, but ultimately there was a fusion. Out with tea, in with coffee, in with arugula, olive oil, pasta, if you like. When men and women meet each other in a social situation today in Melbourne, they'll kiss each other on the cheek. That is a continental affectation that we have absorbed. These ethnic influences shift the host population, in fact, and change our culture, even our sense of design. If you had bought a fashionable terrace house in Albert Park in the 1980s and you wanted to put on an extension, it would have been done as a Victoriana in the Victoriana style. By the 1990s, it would have been done as a glass and concrete minimalist cube. It's very Milan-esque when you think about it. Our palette has shifted to absorb Mediterranean influences. Our sense of design, minimalism, reflects Mediterranean values, if you like. Even our affectations have shifted. We are an absorbent culture. So that's all very interesting. What are the influences that are rising? Chinese, Indian, Arabic. Who had heard of quinoa 5 years ago? Who knew how to pronounce quinoa 5 years ago? It is an Arabic grain. In fact, Australians, particularly Melburnians, measure social sophistication through our palate. We shall not have the quinoa salad, thank you very much. So actually I see Chinese, Indian, Arabic influences in Melbourne emerging over the next 10, 15 years or so. And you think, well, how might that express itself? Do you understand the principles of Feng Shui? You don't have the front door, the back door lined up, it's bad energy, the energy goes straight through the house. If I wanted to maximise the resale value of my Melbourne property in 10 years' time, I want as many people competing for that as possible, rich people, aspirational middle-class Chinese people, I would reconfigure my design so that it reflected the principles of Feng Shui. Anglo eyes can't see it, but it actually broadens the market. I can see Australian design shifting to accommodate Asian influences going forward. There are, of course, other tribes. You can't be in the business of demographics and not have cool acronyms like yuppies and dinks. So here's some of the coolest acronyms to describe the latest tribes of Australia. The first one are the pumpkins, PUMCINS, and I suspect that everyone here is a bit of a pumpkin. Stands for the professional urban middle class in nice suburbs. You can tell pumpkin men on a weekend they wear polo shirts, chinos and boat shoes. And you can tell if you come from a pumpkin household if there's goat's cheese in the fridge. I have this theory that households that eat goat's cheese do not eat McDonald's. They are mutually repellent. Melbourne in particular has what is known as a goat's cheese curtain. It's about 5k out from the CBD and either inside or outside the goat's cheese curtain. You can tell if you're inside the goat's cheese curtain at a cafe if there is smashed avocados and crumbled feta. It is alfresco dining. Who had heard of alfresco dining 30 years ago? Why would you want to eat outside with car fumes? We're Mediterraneanised. Why are we Mediterraneanised? Because of these global influences, ethnic influences. Has that stopped? Or is it a transition? Where are we heading? Should you actually go to Shanghai, walk along the Bund and see the way in which aspirational middle-class Chinese are behaving? And the business, I can say that product, that service, that affectation, that culinary impact could actually be Australianised. That would be a business opportunity to take forward. The next one is the Nettles. This is a young power couple, 35 to 45, kids under the age of 15, both partners working, household income of more than $150,000 per year. Nettle stands for not enough time to enjoy life. You can tell if you come from a Nettle household if after the evening meal you and your partner get out your iPhone and coordinate the next day's activities. And if you email the schedule to your nanny, they're an Uber Nettle. I have seen that done. We make these terms up. My PA came up with the term Nettle. I wrote a column on it in The Australian. The Oz loved it. They put it on page 3. Had a big picture story of a Nettle couple. 2 days later, it popped up in the New York Times New Word Dictionary, so you really know you've made it when you get better with your word. My personal favourite, though, are the Kippers. These are the young 20-somethings that live at home with their 50-something mum and dad. KIPPERS, kids in parents' pockets, eroding retirement. I had a couple of Kippers myself, and then everyone knows some Lombards, LOMBARDS. Lots of money, but a real dickhead. Let's have a look at the way in which the average Australian household, the life cycle has changed over the course of a generation. Go back to 1935 or 1934. The average Australian in 1934 lived for 63 years. You qualified for the age pension at 65, so you promptly dropped dead 2 years before you got a pension. And if you look about this, you're a child for 14 years, and then you're an adult. There were no teenagers. The term teenager was not in common usage prior to the Second World War. Childhood, adulthood, old age, and death. That's the way. No need to save for retirement because you drop dead at work. That's basically the way it was. And you're an old person at 51 or 52. If you were 50 years old and unhappy in your relationship in 1934, you'd think, you know, well, what's the point? I'm going to be dead in 10 years' time. Might as well just wait it out. Whereas baby boomers think, I've got another 30 years of life. I think differently about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, in fact. 40 years later, life expectancy now 71, 6 years in retirement. The term teenager, an invention of the baby boomers, the post-war period, emerged, and you're now not old until into your 60s. 40 years later, 2015, 2014, life expectancy now 82, 17 years in retirement. Although the most common age of retirement for an Australian is not 65, it's 58. That is 24 years in retirement. What are you going to do? Sit at home and babysit the grandkids for 24 years? Baby boomers will not do that. They'll reinvent that. I think they'll work on beyond 60, beyond 65, because they have worked out they haven't saved enough to live in retirement in the manner to which they have become accustomed. But they'll do it differently. They'll work 5 days, then 4, then 3, then 2. This is me working harder. This is me engaged in a portfolio lifestyle. A bit of volunteering, a bit of commercial work, spend time with my spouse. This is the best time in life, it would be argued, in fact. And in fact, the government will support it to extend. What we need is a new term to describe that 55 through to 75. You're not retired, you part worked, you part retired. It's like a new teenage phase in the life cycle. And at the other end of the life cycle, you can see Gen X, Gen Y picking up the teenage phase in the life cycle. They've picked it up and they've stretched it. I think in our teenager, between the ages of 13 and 29, all of the measures of the transition into adulthood that baby boomers make in 21, 22, 23, commitment to marriage, mortgage, children and a career is kicked out to 28, 29 or 30. The driving force behind that is a postponement of commitment to marriage. In 1971, the average age of first marriage for an Australian woman was 21. She was a baby boomer born in 1950. She would have announced her engagement on her 21st birthday, otherwise she thought she was going to be on the shelf. Today, the average age of first marriage for an Australian woman is 29. 8 years have opened up cafes, bars, restaurants, gap years. Who had heard of a gap year 10 years ago? This is an invention by Generation Y, paid for by baby boomer parents, designed to extend that period of adolescence. And in fact, if you were to today announce your engagement on your 21st birthday, you would be regarded as a loser. You should have completed tertiary education, paid off it. The narrative of life has shifted. So I think that nurturing phase in the life cycle goes right through the 20s, up to 30. Baby boomers want to retire at 60 and live to 90. That's 30, 30, 30. How much tax must you pay between 30 and 60 to notionally support yourself for another 60 years of life, let alone to pay for people who do not pay tax? Whatever it is that you think you are paying at the moment, it must increase. The tax yield must increase during the productive 30 to 60 stage in the life cycle. Or we work longer, or we ask the baby boomers to go without, or we do all the three and it still won't be enough. That's probably the narrative for the next 10, 20 years or so. Let's have a look at some of the generations, starting with the baby boomers, or 1946 to 1965, 64 or so. Deeply hierarchical generation, raised by people that touched the Great Depression, that fought in the Second World War. If you're one of 6 baby boomer kids, you understand concepts like deference, hierarchy, waiting your turn and hand-me-down clothes. If you're a single kid raised by rich parents in prosperous times, you wait for nothing. I want it, and I want it now. Then, of course, you have, they're the sandwich generation because they're dealing with their 80-something parents and their 20-something kids. They're sort of pressured from both sides. Then, of course, you have Generation X, today's 30-somethings and 40-somethings, always in the wrong place at the wrong time. I regard X's as the pissed off generation. They are sick of baby boomers and they're sick of Generation Y. Baby boomers got fee-free tertiary education, 1972 to 1987. When did X's go to university? Late 1980s, in came X. Then they went into the workforce, early 1990s, unemployment peaked at 12%. Then they went into the workforce, working to baby boomer management, waiting to get the top job. Just after the year 2000, into the workforce came young Generation Y. And baby boomer management's focus went straight to the Ys. Are we paying you enough, Generation Y? Is anyone being mean to you, Generation Y? No hedgehog pillow, Generation Y. I bet Generation Y, you didn't do that for me when I started in the workforce. The good news for Xers is that you've now got your hands on the top job and now you can wreak your revenge on Generation Y. Then we have Generation Y, today's teenagers and 20-somethings. This is the special generation. From the age of 5, they've been told they are special by their parents, by their teachers, by their employer, which is all well and good. But what happens when this special generation wakes up at the age of 35? They're married with a mortgage and kids looking straight down the barrel towards middle age. They wake up one day and they realise, I'm not rich, I'm not famous, I'm not a celebrity, I've been lied to all my life. It'll all be someone else's fault, of course. How can their middle age possibly live up to the expectations they had in youth? Ultimately, they could be known as the disappointed generation. I do think they are the most entrepreneurial generation in history. They are the most educated, the most widely travelled, the most digitally connected. They're not committed to marriage, mortgage, children, career in their 20s. They can have a go. Have a look at Mark Zuckerberg, 20 years old, Harvard Law School, this technology, that social need, put it together. So we should be harnessing that entrepreneurial spirit and capacity of Generation Y. Then of course you have Generation Z. These are the children, the young kids, the children of Generation X women. The second generation of women who went back to work. They carry no guilt about this. Look kid, I work, get over it, you're not special, that's the way it is. No one steps out of line in a Generation X household. The Generation Z, the Americans call that the millennial generation, I think because they can't pronounce the word Z. So it's the millennials. The argument is that Generation Y was raised to adulthood in an era of unfettered prosperity, the 20-year boom leading up to the global financial crisis. It is only Generation Y that in that period of history could have come up with a term called YOLO. You only live once. Why save for the future? Why not live in the moment? Why would I not have total confidence that the future is going to be better than the past? Whereas Generation Z, the pragmatists, if you like, raised to adulthood in a post-GFC world, rising taxation, rising unemployment, rising uncertainty. The pragmatists, if you like, will come along and clean it all up in the 2020s. Different generations, different times in history, and different expectations, in fact. Let's have a look at jobs, employment in Australia in the 21st century. We can say as a fact, between August 2000 and August 2015, the first 15 years of the 21st century, the Australian people, nation economy has created 3.1 million jobs. Full-time, part-time, good jobs, bad jobs, high-altitude demographics. We've gone from about 8 million workers to about 11 million workers in 15 years. We have lost 340-odd thousand jobs. The closure of the Toyota manufacturing plants and oil refineries or whatever, we can say as a fact, for every job that is lost, there are 10 that have been created. We stress out about losing jobs, but we are oblivious to the fact there are 10 times more jobs being created. The economy is resilient, it's buoyant, it's creative, it's effervescent, it's fizzing around particular areas. I want to hang around that part of the economy that's creating the 10 jobs, because people in that sector of the economy have confidence in the future. They'll max out their credit card, they'll buy stuff, they'll do the YOLO stuff. But what part of the economy is delivering all those jobs? Well, in actual fact, it's up here. Healthcare and social assistance. Of the 3.1 million jobs created, 700,000 as a fact in healthcare, and the oldest baby boomer is 68. Is this a space to be? Probably. Is this going to continue? Probably. Is this going to set the agenda for the next 10, 15 years? Probably, you would say. Or professional services, construction, education. They're the big four. Where do you don't want to be? Where's the unhappy part of the economy? Down here, agriculture and manufacturing. Never look at the numbers in demographics. The numbers are boring. What is the story? What is the narrative? The Australian people are talking to you through this chart and they're telling you about their preferences. When I look at this, I don't see numbers, I see knowledge workers. In order to share in the prosperity of modern Australia in the 21st century, you need either a university degree or technical training. Down here, for 200 years in Australia, you could be a 15-year-old, barely literate and barely numerate, but you could get a job in a factory, on a farm, in a shop, in a warehouse, or as a waiter. Where does unskilled, low-skilled, barely skilled people get a job in the back half of this decade, in the 2020s, if all those sectors that once absorbed unskilled labour is shedding labour because all that work's done in Guangzhou? Well, they don't get a job. Well, what does Melbourne look like? What does Australian society look like when you've got sort of rich knowledge worker hipster people living that lifestyle in the centre of Melbourne, and you've got vast pools of unemployed, underemployed, unemployable people who feel disaffected, disconnected. I don't feel part of this community. I feel disenfranchised. I feel isolated. I feel a tendency towards radicalisation, you would think. It's actually quite a dark future. So, well, there's two ways this can go. One, which is that dark view of the future, where you have vast pools of unemployed, underemployed, disenfranchised people, or you can say, this is actually going to release humanity from boring, repetitive, blue-collar, low-level, white-collar type work, and that natural human instinct is going to burst forth and we'll have more creative industries, wellness, well-being, creative activities. One of the fastest growing jobs in Australia over the last 3 censuses has been the job of photographer. This is a time when every camera, every phone, telephone has a camera in it. I think what that has simply done has been to sharpen our appetite for the visual medium. Creative type jobs, reskilling, upskilling, creative type jobs, social engagement, volunteering, groups like the Lord Summers Camp would be part of that narrative, you think. It's risk mitigation. I do not want isolated, disaffected, disconnected people out in the suburbs feeling that they can't be part of Australian society. And social connectivity through groups like Lord Summers Camp and others are all part of that narrative going forward. Let's take this further, and in fact, I'm not quite sure where we are. Yes, I want to give you a view of Australian society over 100 years. This is the number of people added to Australia between 1950 and 2050. And it's the number of people added, it comes in 2 halves, between 1950 and up to 2005. But it's not the total population added to Australia, it's the number of people added to the retirement bucket, the 65 plus population. Do we not agree, as a fact, since 1950, the number of people added to the retirement bucket every year, let's call it 40,000 people per year. We have had to grow our economy by a sufficient amount to accommodate another 40,000 people every year. So thank you very much, we'll have an age pension. Thank you very much, we'll have pharmaceutical benefits and everything else that's going. That's been up to 2005. Here is the next 45 years in the retirement bucket. That would freak out a treasurer. This is the baby boomer generation. Here we are at the moment, it's the baby boomer generation. You know, these people retiring back here, they came from the Depression. They hold bizarre values. They value concepts like frugality, austerity, going without. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine. The people coming into retirement is the me generation. If you are not in there getting everything you're entitled to and more, then you are a loser. The type of people coming into retirement is the first generation of retirees who will be university educated. Educated, opinionated, articulate, literate, and with time on their hands. This is a dangerous combination for anyone in business. And in fact, you think, well, you know, I'm not feeling well. I want a blood test, I want a CAT scan, I want an MRI scan, and I want to provide it all just down the road because I've paid tax all my working life. The fact that I have not paid enough tax to justify the services that I want, for the length of time that I want to live, is frankly not my problem. That is your problem. And that is the issue that's going to define certainly the next 5, 10, 15 years going forward. And just finally, I'll just move over these points. Finally, I want to introduce you to some new research that I've done on the most recent census. I've scanned every suburb, every neighbourhood, every precinct across the greater metropolitan area of Melbourne in order to find Melbourne's bachelor hotspot. Where is the highest concentration of eligible young bachelors according to the census? And by young, I mean 25 to 35, 5 years either side of prime marriageable age, and single, separated, widowed, never married or divorced. These boys are on the market. Where is the highest concentration of eligible young bachelors relative to eligible young women? I've run the numbers, and the highest concentration according to the census is in the suburb of West Footscray. 2.08 eligible young bachelors per eligible young female. Clearly the West Footscray pub on a Friday night is the place to be. Although I have been told of West Footscray that the odds might be good, but the goods are odd. So, I would never say that, but I have been told. You can in fact do exactly the same analysis for eligible young women. The highest concentration of eligible young women relative to eligible young men of any suburb in Melbourne is to be found in the suburb of Flemington. In fact, 1.41. The girls are always about a $10 cab fare from the CBD in an area of leafy amenity. In Sydney, it's in Woollahra. So, real hospitals and corporate head offices and universities and so forth. The boys are always out in the burbs. Of course, Flemington is separated from West Footscray by Flemington Racecourse, which I think should be renamed the Racecourse of Love. The girls of Flemington with the boys of West Footscray. Thank you very much.